At church, we talk about almost everything. We talk about faith and family, about forgiveness and grace, about the offering plate and the building fund. We'll talk about our health, our kids, our worries, but there's one subject that for all our talking stays strangely quiet, and it's a big one. How the financially wise people sitting in those pews actually handle their money. Money is the great unspoken topic in church. Nobody mentions what they earn, what they've saved, how they invest, or what they quietly do that's kept them secure for 40 years. And so the practical habits, the real down-to-earth money wisdom that some of the most generous, faithful, financially solid people in your congregation live by, almost never get said out loud. They stay private. They stay hidden. They almost never become part of ordinary church conversation. So today, gently, we're bringing 7 of them into the light. And let me be clear up front about what this is and isn't. This is not prosperity gospel nonsense. I'm not going to tell you that faith makes you rich, or that wealth proves God's favor. That's not in here. What's in here is something far more grounded. 7 practical money habits that line up beautifully with Scripture and with plain good sense. The kind of habits your wealthiest, most generous fellow believer actually practices, but would never dream of bringing up at the church potluck. Stay with me to the end, because habit number 6 includes a way to give to your own church that can save you thousands in taxes, one most pastors had never even mentioned. And habit number 7 is the one almost no Christian family does. And skipping it has torn more families apart than I can tell you. Before we start, let me be fair to the church, because I'm not here to criticize it. There are good reasons money stays quiet in a sanctuary. In a sacred space, talking dollars can feel worldly, even a little crude. There's a humility at work. You don't brag about your bank account among believers, and that instinct is right. And there's a real old tension in our faith between the warnings about money's dangers and the practical business of handling it well, so a lot of people simply keep their financial lives private to be safe. None of that is wrong, but it leaves a gap, because when nobody ever talks about the practical side, good people end up repeating avoidable mistakes, while the folks who've quietly figured it out say nothing. So we'll follow a couple who embody what I mean. We'll call them Harold and Ruth. You know this couple. They're the unassuming pair 3 rows back. Modest car, modest clothes, never a word about money. And what almost no one realizes is that, through a few quiet habits, they've become both quietly secure and quietly generous. The kind of people who fund things at church anonymously and never take a bit of credit. Here's what they actually do. Habit number 1, they build wealth and give generously, and refuse to choose. The first habit breaks a false choice that hangs over a lot of church culture. The idea that you either give your money away in faith or you save and build it up, as if doing both somehow can't be done, or worse, as if planning ahead shows a lack of trust. The financially wise believer rejects that either-or entirely. They give generously, often more than anyone knows, and they build steadily, both, at the same time, and Scripture is squarely on their side. Remember Joseph, who stored up grain through 7 good years so the people would survive the 7 years of famine? That wasn't faithlessness. That was wisdom that saved a nation. The book of Proverbs points to the humble ant who gathers and stores in summer for the winter ahead. And it says, bluntly, that anyone who fails to provide for their own household has, in effect, denied the faith. Building is not the opposite of believing. Yet at church, the conversation is almost always about giving, the tithe, the offering, the campaign, and almost never about the building. So people hear only half the message. Harold and Ruth heard both. They gave faithfully off the top every paycheck their whole lives. And they also quietly saved and invested, steadily, for 40 years. The giving and the building weren't in competition. They fed each other. The more they built, the more they could give. The takeaway, giving and saving are not enemies. Do both, on purpose. The most generous people are very often the ones who also plan the most carefully. Habit number 2. They treat managing money as a spiritual discipline. The second habit flips something most people get exactly backwards. They treat handling money well not as a worldly distraction from their faith, but as an actual expression of it. There's a subtle message that floats around a lot of churches. That money is of the world. A bit dirty, something spiritual people shouldn't care too much about. And that leaves many sincere believers feeling vaguely guilty for being good with money, as if competence with dollars were somehow less holy than being bad with them. But look at what Jesus actually taught. In the parable of the talents, a master gives 3 servants money to manage. 2 of them invest it wisely and multiply it, and the master calls them good and faithful. The third, out of fear, buries his in the ground to keep it safe, and that servant, the one who refused to steward what he was given, is the one who's condemned. Notice what happened there. Burying the money was the sin. Managing it faithfully was the act of obedience. That reframes everything. Tending your finances carefully, budgeting, saving, investing wisely, not wasting what you've been given, isn't a distraction from faithfulness. It is faithfulness applied to the resources in your hand. Whatever you do, Scripture says, do it heartily as to the Lord. That includes your money. But you'll rarely hear it framed that way at church, so a lot of devout people quietly neglect their finances and call it spirituality. Harold and Ruth saw it differently. They believed God handed them a portion to manage, and managing it well was simply part of taking that trust seriously. The takeaway: being good with money isn't unspiritual. Faithful stewardship of what you've been given is part of the assignment, not a distraction from it. And that idea, managing what you've been given wisely, is also why some retirees look beyond just stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and real estate. One option people often don't realize exists is a gold IRA. Basically, it lets you hold physical gold coins and bars inside a retirement account, with many of the same tax advantages people associate with a traditional IRA. It just comes back to the same old wisdom. Don't put everything in one basket. For many Americans over 50, most of their retirement savings are tied to the stock market, and we all know how unpredictable that can be. So, as part of being a careful steward of your retirement money, it's worth at least understanding how physical gold could fit into your broader retirement plan. If you want to learn more about how a gold IRA works and how to set one up, there's a free Gold IRA information guide from Augusta Precious Metals that breaks it all down. You can grab it using the link in the description below. It's 100% free, so make sure you check it out. Habit number 3. They live quietly below their means. The third habit is the one that hides them in plain sight. They live well below what they could afford, quietly without display. There's a phrase for this in the financial world: stealth wealth. It means having resources but not showing them off, and it lines up perfectly with what Scripture prizes: humility, contentment, and a refusal to chase status. Godliness with contentment, Paul writes, is great gain. The financially wise believer takes that to heart. They don't buy things to impress the congregation or the neighbors. They drive the older car, keep the modest house, and let their security stay invisible. That gap between what they could spend and what they choose to spend is exactly where their freedom and their generosity come from. Here's why you never hear about this one at church. By its very nature, it's hidden. The whole point of stealth wealth is that nobody knows. The quietest, most unassuming couple in the building may well be the most financially secure, precisely because they never made it about appearances. Harold and Ruth could have lived much larger than they did. They chose not to, year after year, and that quiet discipline is what gave them something to be generous with. The takeaway: spend far less than you could, and don't broadcast what you have. The space between your income and your lifestyle is where both your security and your generosity are born. Habit number 4. They keep reserves, and they don't apologize for it. The fourth habit pushes against a piece of well-meaning bad theology that quietly does a lot of damage. They keep solid reserves, an emergency fund, real margin, and they refuse to feel guilty about it. You've probably heard the sentiment, maybe said it yourself: why save so much? Doesn't the Bible say not to worry about tomorrow? Shouldn't I just trust God to provide? And there's a sincere faith behind that question. But it gets the wisdom exactly backwards. Look at Scripture again. Joseph stored grain for the famine. The ant lays up food before the winter. Proverbs says plainly that the prudent person sees trouble coming and takes shelter, while the simple keep walking and pay for it. Saving for hard times isn't a failure to trust God. In the Bible, it's frequently how God's wisdom shows up. Trusting God and keeping an emergency fund are not opposites. They're partners. The financially wise believer holds both at once. They have deep faith and they keep a cushion, months of expenses set aside, so that a job loss, a medical bill, A broken furnace doesn't become a catastrophe. They sleep well not because they trust the cushion instead of God, but because the cushion is part of how they've been faithful with what God gave them. This rarely comes up at church, because that false piety, the idea that real faith means no reserves, sounds spiritual, even though it leaves families terrifyingly exposed. Harold and Ruth always kept their reserve, quietly, and it's why they never once had to panic in 50 years. The takeaway: keeping a healthy emergency fund isn't a lack of faith, it's wisdom. Prepare for the hard times the way Joseph did, and feel no guilt about it. Habit number 5. They refuse to go into debt to look blessed. The fifth habit is about a particular kind of pressure that's especially strong in some faith communities, and the wise quietly resist it. They refuse to take on debt just to look prosperous, or, as it sometimes gets framed, to look blessed. Scripture is blunt about debt. The borrower is servant to the lender. It describes a real loss of freedom. When you owe, a piece of your future already belongs to someone else. And the financially wise believer takes that seriously. But there's a specific trap they're especially careful to avoid: borrowing to keep up appearances. In certain circles, there's a quiet pressure to look like God has blessed you. The nicer car, the bigger house, the put-together life, and it tempts good people to finance an image they can't actually afford, sliding into bondage to project a blessing they don't feel. The wise refuse that game entirely. They'd rather be quietly free than visibly impressive. They understand that real blessing is owning your life outright, not performing prosperity on credit. You won't hear this discussed at church because nobody wants to admit that some of the blessing on display in the parking lot is actually financed to the hilt. Harold and Ruth never borrowed to impress anyone. Their freedom didn't look like much from the outside. And that was exactly the point. The takeaway: don't go into debt to look successful or blessed. Quiet freedom is worth infinitely more than financed appearances. Habit number 6. They give strategically, generously, and often in secret. Now, habit 6. The one I promised could save you real money. The wise don't just drop a check in the Sunday plate and call it done. They give strategically, generously, and very often anonymously, in ways the church rarely explains. Start with the heart of it, which is straight from Jesus. When you give, he said, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give in secret. The most generous believers take that seriously. Their biggest gifts are quiet, sometimes completely anonymous, given for an audience of one. But here's the part that genuinely surprises people, because it sits at the intersection of generosity and the tax code. Territory Church rarely touches. There are far smarter ways to give than writing a personal check. Here's the most powerful one, because so few people in the pews have heard of it. If you're 70 and a half or older and you have a traditional retirement account, you can give money directly from that IRA to your church, up to $111,000 a year in 2026. And that money is completely tax-free. It never counts as income to you. And once you're at the age when the government forces you to take withdrawals from that account, this giving can satisfy that requirement without raising your taxes a dollar. Think about that. You can fund your tithe straight from your IRA and legally skip the tax you'd otherwise pay on that money. It's called a qualified charitable distribution, and it is one of the most beautiful tax gifts in the entire code for a generous retiree. And I bet almost no one at your church has ever mentioned it. There are others. Instead of giving cash, the wise often give appreciated stock, shares that have grown in value, directly to the church, which lets them skip the capital gains tax they'd owe if they sold it. While the church gets the full value, some use a giving account called a donor-advised fund to plan their generosity in a tax-smart way. None of this is about giving less. It's the opposite. These tools let you give more because less is lost to taxes along the way. Harold and Ruth gave quietly, but they also gave wisely, and the wisdom let their generosity stretch further than anyone knew. The takeaway: give generously, give quietly, and learn the smart ways to give, like straight from your IRA, so more of your money reaches the cause and less goes to taxes. Habit number 7. They plan their legacy, money, and death out loud. And the 7th habit is the one that almost no one does, the one I warned tears families apart when it's skipped. The wise plan their legacy deliberately. They sit down and deal with money and death, out loud, on purpose. Scripture points here directly. A good man leaveth an inheritance to his children's children. Not just to his children, to his grandchildren. That's long-term, multi-generational thinking. The faithful steward doesn't just manage money for today. They plan how it will bless the people who come after them. And that means doing the things almost everyone avoids. Making a will, setting up the right arrangements, deciding clearly who gets what. And, just as importantly, preparing their heirs to handle it wisely so a sudden inheritance doesn't ruin them instead of blessing them. Here's why this never comes up at church. It combines the two most taboo subjects on earth, money and death, into one conversation nobody wants to have. So families avoid it, year after year, until it's too late. And the result is heartbreaking and common. A parent passes with no clear plan, and the children who loved each other their whole lives end up fighting bitterly over the house, the accounts, the things. The money that was meant to bless them becomes the wedge that divides them. The wise refuse to leave that landmine for the people they love. They plan it out, they write it down, and they talk about it while they're healthy enough to do it with grace. There's even a quiet kindness in the tax law that rewards this. In many cases, assets passed to your heirs at your death get their tax cost reset to current value, which can wipe out the tax on a lifetime of growth. But only if you've planned how to pass them on. Harold and Ruth had every document in order, and they sat their kids down and explained it all, years ahead. When the time came, there were tears, but there was no war. The takeaway: make the plan, write the will, talk to your family about money and death while you still can. It's one of the most loving things you'll ever do for the people you leave behind. Step back and look at all 7 together, and you'll see they share one root. Notice what's not here. Not one of these habits is get rich, and not one is feel guilty for having anything. Every single one lives in a both-and that church culture too often turns into an either-or. Think about the false choices these habits quietly refuse. Either you're spiritual or you're good with money. Either you give or you build. Either you trust God or you plan ahead. Either you're generous or you're careful. The financially wise believer looks at every one of those and says, why not both? They've discovered the thing the silence at church keeps hidden. That being a good steward of money isn't the opposite of faith. It's an expression of it. Strip away the dollar signs, and all 7 of these habits are just one thing: faithfulness, applied to money. That's the whole secret, and it was never really a secret at all. Now let me be careful and fair the way this subject deserves. First and most important, this is not the prosperity gospel, and I want to say that as plainly as I can. None of this means wealth is proof of God's favor, or that being poor is a spiritual failure. That teaching is false, and it wounds people, and it's the opposite of what's here. Plenty of the most faithful people who ever lived had very little, and Scripture honors them. These habits are about stewardship and freedom, not about a bigger pile being holier. Second, these are wise principles, not guarantees. The Proverbs describe how life generally works, not ironclad promises. The book of Job is the story of a righteous man who lost everything through no fault of his own. Do these things and you'll likely be more secure and more free. You will not be handed a promise that hardship never comes. Third, real constraints are real. Not everyone can save the same way, give the same amounts, or build the same security. And that is absolutely okay. None of this is a measure of your worth or your faith. And the church's focus on the soul over the financial details isn't wrong. It's just incomplete, and these habits are meant to fill the gap, not replace the gospel. For some believers, a call to radical simplicity is genuine and beautiful, and I'd never argue them out of it. Take what serves you and hold it humbly. So here's the quiet truth underneath all of it. The wealthiest, most generous people in your church didn't get there because they loved money. They got there because they quietly married their faith to a little practical wisdom, and then used what it produced to give, to bless, to be free, and to leave something good behind. They were never the loudest people in the room. They were Harold and Ruth, 3 rows back, saying nothing and doing everything right. You don't need a finance degree or a fortune to live this way. You just need to stop treating money management as the enemy of your faith and start treating it as part of it. And you can break the silence right where it matters most. Not in the sanctuary, but at your own kitchen table, with your spouse and your kids, having the honest conversations the rest of us are too polite to have. That's where every one of these habits begins. The church will tend your soul, but the practical wisdom, The kind that quietly builds a secure, generous, free life, that one's on you to seek out. Now you've got 7 places to start.